Good afternoon. Hey, good afternoon, everybody. We're going to bring the meeting to order, and the first thing we are going to do is I'd like to recognize Chairman Perkle. If you could, please open us up in prayer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Bow with me, if you will. Dear Heavenly Father, in the quiet of this moment, Lord, I pray that that you will direct our hearts. Lord, I thank you for your provisions for us. I pray that you'll be with our families that are away from us right now. We each have those in our life that are hurting physically, or they have some ailment. Lord, I pray that you'll bless them. Give us great wisdom right now as we look about these matters. In your name I pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Chairman Perkle. Members of the committee, I know that we're a little light. We have some conflict, but what we'd like to do, I've asked Senator Albers here, and thank you very much, Senator. We're going to go ahead and have a hearing only, as we've done this year, and I've appreciated the committee's hard work in terms of the AI bills. We don't have Judy here with us, and I think the senator is probably glad for that. But I think at the end of the day, what I'd like to be able to do is get through, have the senator present the bill, and then get as many questions as possible so that we can continue to work on this bill. Hopefully that works for everyone. And with that stated, Senator, the mic's yours.
Mr. Chairman, thank you to you and this august committee for hearing Senate Bill 473, the Georgia Consumer Privacy Protection Act. Many of us have heard of the privacy laws that have begun both around the country as well as around the world. Many years ago, it began with a bill that started in California, then was adopted in different types of language across a myriad of states. Many of you here know some of those acronyms that started over in the European Union, such as GDPR. Data protection rights have increasingly become a hot topic because of our information that now sits out there all through the cyber world. And as that data has been used to be sold and resold again in order to market and continue to grow business, it also has been used without permission in some cases. It also has been used in nefarious ways, unfortunately, when data is not protected. And we have seen sometimes on a weekly basis ransomware attacks, malware attacks, where people have had data in their systems that have been compromised. And most everyone, I would think, has either been directly impacted by this, or you certainly have a family member or a friend who has. There are some really good pieces of legislation that have been working through the system to what I call create the unique balance between protecting consumers' rights as well as working together with our business community and making sure that scale is even. It is important for both that we get this right. A couple of states that we looked at that seem to really be on the forefront of making that happen were both Utah and Tennessee. When we did the research on this back beginning last summer and fall, we originally were going down the path of Utah's bill. And then at the beginning of this year, after numerous meetings and consultations with the business community, the chambers, et cetera, we decided that the Tennessee model, the base of that bill, seemed to have more of an alignment and agreement from most parties. So we took that as a base bill, but like everything else, we want to make sure that it's Georgia-centric and it fits what we need and what we want here. Now, you might be asking yourself, why would I bring this bill forward? Some states have it, some don't. Well, ideally, I wish I did not have to bring this forward because this would be something solved at our federal government and federal level. However, I think we all know, and certainly in my last 14 years of serving in this legislative body, that if we wait on the feds to do anything, we'll be waiting an awful long time. I wish for consistency, but that's what we tried to do in the state level. We've seen these bills happening everywhere, and I don't want Georgia to get caught behind, nor do I want us to overreact where I think places like California got it wrong. They went too far, and it's causing a lot of chaos and unrest, both with consumers as well as the business community. So we tried to craft a unique balance here. And as we go through the bill, and I'm just going to hit some of the high levels right now, there are areas of the law that you're going to see here that are already preempted by federal law. just as everything else is. There are certain things that will always supersede a state law. Of course, you've all heard of HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. Most of you have heard of Gramm-Leach-Bliley, which governs a lot of the financial institutions, or PCI DSS with credit cards. So some of those are already existing in code, and they have very specific and stringent rules and guidelines that you will see throughout the bill are referenced, because our bill, again, cannot supersede theirs, but also we don't want to create confusion to either the consumer nor to might be that hospital group or that banking institution as well. And the goal isn't to increase everybody's workload. It's actually to both streamline it as well as have consistency as we go through the code. So when you go through the typical definitions of a bill, we really create these different groups. And I think this is important for people to understand what the main roles are. So there's the consumer. That's all of us, right? It's our data that is out there in all these systems today. You'll hear the words PII, personally identifiable information about us. Then there is what's called a controller. A controller is the person or the company that determines the purpose and the means for how they're processing information. What are they doing with that consumer's data? And the last is the processor. That's the person who actually processes that personal information on behalf of the controller. So perhaps a third party that's doing it on behalf. Think of some type of an internet site that is working for a company that's gathering information, pulling it in and out. The goal for this is really to streamline it to the businesses that have a certain threshold of the amount of revenue they do and amount of transactions. However, eliminating somebody's data, calling an opt-out, is a very simple thing to do. So you've seen probably recently in the last year or so, if you've got an iPhone or an Android phone, which I'm sure everybody does, that all of a sudden when you got your app updates, it says, can you track my data? Allow to track or don't allow to track? Well, part of that is because they're complying with other state laws now that they have to ask those questions, because when you log on to, I don't care whether you want to do CNN or Fox News or you want to do ESPN Sports or wherever you're going, they're trying to glean information from you in order to sell that data. And it is your prerogative as a consumer to say, you know what? I don't want you to track and take my data anymore. Now, some people do, and that's okay. You may want to opt into certain things because you want more information. You want, because you might take cruises all the time, you want them to send you those emails for the specials for the next time you want to take your family to the Caribbean. That's okay. But it comes back to the consumer choice and decision in that. Opting out is a very simple process that I will talk about a lot, both selling data as well as opting out. Opting out is very simply that I may have done business. I may have gone to my favorite restaurant for 10 years. And all of a sudden, all I do is get 5 emails a day. And now I realize that they have 4 other restaurants. Now I'm getting 5 emails from their restaurants. And now they got a partnership with a distributor who's selling wine. I'm getting their emails. For me to say, whoa, opt me out. Sometimes you do that on an email. Pretty simple. Sometimes you go to their website and you send them a note and opt-out provision. Pretty simple stuff. Eliminates your digital footprint. Why is that important to me and to you? 2 reasons. The first reason is shouldn't be spammed all the time if I don't want it. But the second purpose is every place that my personally identifiable information is sitting out there is a chance, if they get ransomwared or malwared, etc., that data could be potentially exposed. So I, by background, work in technology. That is my paying job. And I will tell you, I want the smallest amount of my digital footprint out there in the world as possibly could be. But this gives each individual those rights. So once we get through the definitions, it cites, again, a lot of those different provisions for the federal law. Again, we talked about HIPAA, we talked about Gramm-Leach-Bliley, but then I want to talk about the sale of data. So sale of data, some days, can be just what it sounds like. I own a company, I collect a lot of information. I go to another company and say, hey, I got 500,000 people's names and information who I know like these types of things. Well, if you're a marketer, that's pretty valuable information because I can directly market to you, and that costs That's a lot of valuable data that you can sell and barter back and forth. That's one way that truly a sale could happen. But there's also other benefits. You might work with 3 or 4 affiliates and you might say, hey, let's just all share our data. We won't charge each other, but everybody can win. Well, that's still my data, right? So the sale of data talks about disclosing that information, sharing that information, and selling that data. Again, pretty simple, but it comes back to it is the individual's information and data that we're trying to protect. And it'll take you through, I'm not going to read this a big bill about what sensitive data is, how target advertising is done, et cetera. As we were working through this bill, we met with stakeholders, I think we're at 11 times now, including 2 meetings just in the last 2 weeks in the mezzanine conference room in the Capitol with, I think we had about 30 stakeholders in each one of those meetings. We assembled a lot of feedback. I would be remiss if I didn't thank our legislative counsel, Sean Marie, for her amazing work on gathering this information from the multiple states as we crafted the bill, to the feedback that we received and helping to get to where we are today, because we did have to make tweaks and changes to make sure it was truly Georgia-specific and centric. I'm going to bucket this now into the 3 specific areas that it impacts. First area it impacts, we talked about, were businesses, and that's pretty self-explanatory. Then there are all those who have federal guidelines that are already in place. And then last are all, I'm going to call the 501s, 501c3, C4, C6, all those not-for-profit type of organizations that are out there that are unique in their own way. And in their provisions for the 501s, if they sell data in any which way, shape, or form, then they have to comport to this bill. If they don't sell data, they simply have to have an opt-out. Pretty simple. Pretty easy. I had one non-for-profit, a great one here, communicate through their lobbyist that, oh, this will be so hard, it'll be so terrible, I can't believe we'll never be able to opt somebody out of the system. I will be honest with you. If somebody can't take somebody's data out of the system, then they are not securing that information to begin with, because securing takes 99% of work versus the 1% of work to take someone out of a system. So I think that we've come to some really good consensus. I appreciate you, Mr. Chairman, allowing us having a hearing only today, as we've gotten a last little bit of feedback from a couple of parties. But I will just say, as we've worked through this, I think we have made most people at this point pretty happy. We did have a couple of groups who decided they would wait until 2 months, 6 months, or 9 months later to give us their feedback at the last minute and are making their procrastination our emergency. You know who you are. And we will still try to work through that with them as we fine-tune this important piece of legislation. With that, I know that was a lot of information, and this is too big a bill to read verbatim to you, and I will not do that, and I would yield for questions and comments.
I will. Thank you very much, Senator. I sure do appreciate that. I don't understand exactly what you're talking about, procrastination. That never happens at the Gold Dome. Yeah.
It must just happen on the Senate side.
It just must happen on the Senate side, exactly. The surprise of the century is that no one has hit their button, and I find that absolutely, for this committee, there we go. There, I had a feeling that would cause, now it's a Christmas tree. Okay, so I did read the new sub, all 27 or 29 pages. So I sure do appreciate the work that you put into it, and I appreciate the work speaking with all the different stakeholders. It seems as if this might be, version 35, and I know that my colleague to the right, he understands what it means to have several versions based on the AI bills that he's doing. So thank you very much. I know that it's tough. So I'd like to recognize Whit Park.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I appreciate certainly the intention of this bill. It's great to see Georgia finally trying to move forward with some important data consumer protection pieces of legislation. I'm also still working on digesting and fully trying to understand this, but I do have some initial questions, at least based on the presentation. I'm certainly looking forward to seeing where the other folks are on this bill as well. But one, So opt-out versus opt-in. Could you speak to, if we are trying to ensure that we have as small of a digital footprint as possible, why would we not want opt-in as opposed to opt-out?
Yes, in most cases, opt-in is going to be the preferred method. My concern, and this is a great question, Representative Park, is most of your data that's out there today already, right? It's already out there, so I want a chance to pull it back. In most cases, if you read through this bill, you're going to see that in order to capture their data and hold it and do anything with it, they're going to have to do that anyway if they're going to go through that process. So I think you'll see some of that in this language today. But as I was speaking and introducing the bill, I was more focused on what's already kind of out there in cyberspace today. But you are right, and part of this bill is an opt-in provision, which is important.
With respect to ensuring that there's as much certainty within the marketplace for a lot of the big tech companies, how much of this bill is kind of in line with those states that have already passed similar protections? Is there anything somewhat anomalous in which some of the larger companies that this would apply to would then have to change their, what they're doing in order for them to continue to operate in Georgia?
That's a great question. The bill is probably 98% what the Tennessee bill is today. We started out almost with a complete version of Tennessee. Some changes were made in the Senate committee. We have since rolled a few of those back and made some tweaks. I would say that there are probably two main areas that are a little bit different. One, as it pertains to non-for-profits, there was a complete exemption for non-for-profits in the Tennessee bill, not in some others, which, again, if anybody sells data, to me, they should be subject to these terms, and everybody should have an opt-out. And then a second part toward the end of the bill was adopting some type of a policy framework. NIST is the standard that most people either use or it is based upon. Some people go to what's called ISO 27001. There are a lot of other ones. So we just made it that would reasonably conform to NIST or another like type solution to make sure that we're using something recognizable to protect that. I think most companies obviously want to protect their data because if they are either compromised or have any type of backlash from their consumers, ultimately it hurts their credibility, their reputation, and potentially the growth of their business. So having the parameters in place, I think, will be good. That's why, again, we modeled it substantially after Tennessee. And I think what typically happens with these bills, it starts in one state and they learn some things along the way. And I think that Tennessee was probably close to his right, and I believe will probably be the standard moving forward.
I've got two or three more questions, if I may.
Please, Mr. Whip.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So one, talking about the selling of data, can you help me identify where those provisions are in the bill? Just because, if I'm trying to take a macro perspective on this, I think, frankly, the United States is far behind the world, at least the EU, when it comes to protecting data privacy, including the ability of big tech companies to sell our data, for profit, in which, personally, I would love to see as strong of a bill as possible. I understand the importance of ensuring a balance, but would the provisions in this bill related to the selling of data essentially be kind of a rubber stamp, or would it actually provide additional Georgians the ability to determine whether or not their information could be sold?
I think if you begin on line 130, where it talks about the sale of personal information, it details very specifically what that information is. And if they fall into those provisions, as you'll continue through the bill, you'll see what they're being accountable to. And you're right, I'm quite familiar with, GDPR, obviously the European Union's version of data privacy, as well as some of the others. In some states, they've actually created a bit of confusion, and they're struggling through that. In fact, I know the California legislature has tried to amend this bill, I think 7 or 8 different times since it's been onset, because they did things probably on the very bleeding edge rather than the leading edge, where when it got to other states, got to Virginia, Colorado, then eventually, the last two that I think really kind of honed in to find a better solution was Utah and then Tennessee. But it's a balance, right? And there's nothing perfect. I've learned anything in my time serving here is I never let the perfect be the enemy of the possible.
All right. So two more questions, if I may. Are there any civil rights protections in this bill?
I don't believe this has anything to do with civil rights.
Well, at least with respect to ensuring personal information isn't being used to harm civil rights. I know, especially when it comes to AI and some of these more automated systems, any sort of biases that are implicit is always an area of concern. But is there any protections in here with respect to civil rights?
I certainly appreciate where you're going with that, but I don't think that pertains to here at all, because personal information is personal information. We're talking about not selling or distributing or remove your personal information, and the goal that anybody wouldn't be able to use that in any way that's nefarious, but I don't think that would be applicable to this bill.
Thank you. And last question, when it comes to enforcement of the bill, is there a private cause of action? Or
there is remedies through the Attorney General in order to take care of that. We looked at that specific issue of private right to action, and it's a good question. And in the analysis of all the bills that are out there, none of them had a private right to action, and there was a consensus that creating a brand new one in light of no one else in the nation doing that would be not an appropriate stance for Georgia at this time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Whip. And my hunch is Chairman Wiedauer would put an amendment in about biases being permitted against that school in Athens. But, we can ask him. Okay. All right. Chairman Perkle.
Speaking of said bias, I will readily admit that I've been through only 17 pages of this bill. So the answer that I'm seeking might be in the last 10 pages of the bill. It is so important, and I think sometimes we don't realize when our data has been sold or used against us. Each of us probably have had someone, my first, second or third year up here, my truck was broken into, and somebody stole my stuff, and I got to tell you, mad as a wet setting hen. I think sometimes with data breach, we don't know when that happens. Is there a way that you can explain to us that might not be in the tech world as you are, how vulnerable we are and what this can do to, I'm not going to say erase our footprints in the digital world, but at least protect us from where we've been and not necessarily where we're going?
And that is a great question, and for me, it was really one of the large impetus reasons I wanted to get this bill to move forward. Today, your personal information is in thousands of places. Thousands. That's just a fact, right? Part of that was by our own volition. We put it up on social media. We signed up for office and somebody scraped that information off the screen. We did it with our credit cards and our hotel points and our Delta Sky miles and all the stuff that we enjoy. And what started out many years ago, and I'll share a brief story because I think this might help tie it together. I was a partner in a large consulting firm, and I was doing work for AT&T at the time. And I remember their head of their wireless division saying, we're never going to get in the business of doing something with somebody's personal data. That is not our business. We think that's wrong, terrible. The next year, they announced one of their largest increases in revenue, new business models, was selling data. So I certainly went up to him, shook his hand. I said, well, what changed? He goes, well, it's a lot more valuable than I thought. So the reality is it should concern each and every one of you where your data is. And if you know what's happening in the cyber criminal part of the world, right? We saw it just down the road here in our own Fulton County just 4.5 weeks ago, where they had a ransomware attack, where they've got confidential information. We saw it not too long ago when Colonial Pipeline was shut down a couple of years ago. If I went to Midtown Atlanta through a rock, every single building has got somebody who has had a data breach. And the more places your data is, my data is, all of our data is, the more opportunity is to get out there. So shrinking that footprint, as I called it, are we going to get everyone? The answer is no. But if it was in 1,000 places and I can get it down to 100, I'm feeling 90% better. And I think that's where we want to go as well. Again, it's just it's our personal preferences to do that. And I'll add one more simple analogy: the do not call list. Most of us put
Right.
ourselves years ago on that do not call list
That's right.
because we didn't want to keep getting the phone ring in the middle of supper time, right? And that's a reasonable thing that we
I
can
just
ask
got
for.
one right now.
I'm sure. And do not text list as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Perkle. Chairman Parsons?
Thank you, Chairman. Senator, appreciate you working on the issue. It is a large bill. It's kind of a large bill. We'll be looking at this late in the session, I think. But I wanted to ask you, just trying to understand what you're doing better. On line 106 in your definitions, I think it's back in definitions, one of the subsets here is data generated by or connected to advanced utility metering infrastructure systems or equipment for use by utility. So I guess my question is, what would this bill, I can see that people might be concerned about somebody knowing how much electricity they use or what time of day. I mean, I don't know why that would, I could see it being an issue with some, it wouldn't be an issue to me, but it could be. But how would this bill relate to that? I mean, it's in here in the definitions of things I guess would be affected by the legislation. So how would that work? What would a Georgia Power or an EMC or a MEAG have to do to allow a subscriber or a member or whoever to opt out of having any information collected and sold? I mean, that's just an example I can get out of here, and I just kind of know, it would explain to me anyway better how it would work.
Yeah, and thank you, Chairman Parsons, my fellow Cobb delegation mate. They actually have an exemption to stay out of it because we do need to have that information for them, similar to the way it does for things such as HIPAA and Gramm-Leach Bliley, et cetera. We actually do need. There's a reasonable reason to hold that in there, up to including, as an example, at EMC has to hold data for even 10 years after someone moves. So if I would leave my house and if Cobb EMC covered my house and I moved to an area that was Georgia Power, they actually have a reason to hold my data for the next 10 years because they may owe me a check, right? Because the way the cooperatives work, I know you're an expert in that field, would need that. So it actually provides in this bill a mechanism to hold certain data for certain reasons that would be outside of the norm.
So if I may, I just want to make sure I'm clear on this. So you're saying hold that information. You're talking about that company holding that information from being able to release it to anybody else.
Correct. They could not be sold, and it could not be deleted because they have to hold it for the reasons of you either being a current or former client for what they owe you.
So this would be an example of where the customer really wouldn't have any reason to opt in or opt out because the information is being held.
That's correct.
So I would imagine there'd be, I haven't really gone through all these, but I would imagine that would be quite a few examples of that. Is that correct?
Yes, there is, and that's why those protections are in place, just for folks like that. And again, the same thing is true for HIPAA, or if you do medical trials, your credit card information, things of that nature. There's some things that have to be exempted from that because of the nature of what they are and what they control.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Oliver?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm trying to understand the practicality of this for me, setting aside the fact that I'm a politician and everything's public. But on line 133, you're defining what is not included in what we're talking about, and the voluntary offering that most of us make on Facebook, Instagram. That data is public regardless of whatever this bill passes. But what about if I use Facebook as a retail outlet to buy makeup and use my PayPal to do that? When does that exemption become relevant?
That's a great question. Once you get into a PayPal for purchasing things, that falls under the credit card laws, which is called PCI DSS, the payment card system, and that has its own federal rules and regulations in order how they hold that data. And if you're like me, I've got a Delta American Express Sky Miles card, right? You can then go in there and opt out of their programs if you don't want to continually get that stuff, but they are going to have to hold on to basic information because of the financial rule and what's governed by the federal law. which
I
we
have
can't
that
control.
credit card too. So under the law, I have to opt out, or Amex is selling what I buy.
Well,
to
they are
somebody?
governed under PCI DSS. We cannot actually control what they do. They are controlled by federal law.
Does that mean they can sell what I buy on my Amex card?
Your data is being sold regularly by the credit cards. There's no doubt about that. Different ones have different programs and procedures, and some of us, opting out is tough, but I wish I could control some of the federal stuff. I hope one day we'll have more federal controls. There have been some rules put in place for PCI DSS over the years that is starting to tighten that down a little bit.
But what you're telling me is that this bill doesn't help me about selling.
Now, for your
my
credit card, no, I cannot help you there. I'm sorry.
May I ask also, Mr. Chairman, I'm looking that you've given on line 613 exclusive authority to enforce this article to the Attorney General. There are no criminal penalties throughout this. This is a civil penalty enforcement act.
Correct.
Does your examination of other states similarly give only authority to the Attorney General? And
Correct.
what's their experience? Do they ever bring a case?
Well, I know there have been cases brought throughout the nation. When we looked at this was a big issue of how this was going to be done. We talked about the Attorney General doing that. We talked about a local district attorney doing it. We talked about civil rights of action, as Representative Park mentioned. And what we found is that was inconsistent with everybody else's law at this time. Now, this is controlling your personal identifiable information. If someone uses that to cause identity theft, et cetera, there is a whole criminal subsection they can go after them on anyway, right? So that's a separate issue at this point. This will evolve over time like anything else will, but this is very consistent with all the other states.
I'm very trying to figure out practically how this bill is going to help me.
Well, I think a couple of ways. I think the first thing it's going to do is make sure that nobody in the future is going to be selling your data that you have signed up for without your express written consent. Also allow you to opt out. And like I said, if you're in 1,000 places, you might want to get rid of 900. That's what I want to do, right? I want to reduce my digital footprint, and I want to make sure that with that, those folks are they've got a process in place that's going to protect my data so I don't become a victim of any type of cybercrime.
But I can't enforce it myself personally.
Well, we need help, right? And that's what the law is designed to do, is to help give you the tools you need to in order to do that.
I don't have the tools if the Attorney General is the only one with exclusive authority.
Well, but he or she serves by the will of the people. We get to elect that person every 4 years.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Oliver. Representative Tran?
I don't have any questions.
Oh, I apologize. We're good. Representative Kendrick?
Thank you, and thank you for bringing the bill. My question is about the application date on line 607, 2026, which is, would be a couple of years from now. Could you talk through why the 2-year waiting period?
Yeah, that's a great question. That, in working with the key stakeholders, and I do want to reiterate the many, many months we've been working on this bill, even though I know it is big, and it hits a lot of areas. Some of it, you'll see, shows a little bit redundancy. It was to give everybody the proper time to make sure they had everything in place. Now, do I believe some of these folks already have it in place because they have to do it in the other states? The answer is yes. There are some that do not. And there are some, like our 501c3, 4, 6, et cetera, that this will be new to. And I think I'd rather make sure we have a nice ramp up to do this right than to not. And I think in trying to balance a win from both the consumers and business community, that this was reasonable. If I looked at the other bills when they went to effect, they all had kind of a minimum 2 to 3 or 4 years of implementation time before it went live.
Okay, can I ask a follow-up question? So on lines 171 and 177, and I'm sorry I missed the first part of this. I had another committee meeting, but you said this bill was taken from Tennessee, and I'm assuming it had similar numbers. So I'm assuming you're trying not to target smaller businesses. So is this language taken from that Tennessee bill, pretty much?
Exactly. And, I think as businesses continue to evolve and have more and more data, my guess is in 10 years from now, long after I'm gone, this will continue to be looked at and refined just as the world changes. But this is to be substantially the same with not just Tennessee, but the other states that have been passing similar legislation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Kendrick. Representative Holcomb.
In terms of the impact on cyber breaches.
Excuse me, Scott, is your mic on?
I think so.
Press the back of it. Press the back. No, press the little thing behind here. Yep. Press that one.
2.
All
I'll
right.
try this one. Does this one work?
Yeah.
All right, sorry. With respect to the impact on cybersecurity breaches, which you're right, that's very, very common, other than having, or an individual having the right to delete their information, presumably proactively, is there any other impact on cyber breaches that this bill offers?
If you would, I'm going to direct you toward the end of the bill on page 26. It says a controller or a processor that we defined earlier can have a defense of a cause of action, so the Attorney General coming to them if they maintain certain things. So maintaining starts in something called NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or other type of a similar group. So if you look from cybersecurity perspective, right, there are kind of baseline frameworks of how you keep things secure. And this is kind of the basic, I would call, foundational standard. There are many others that are out there. As an example, most people try to achieve something called ISO 27001. That's the gold standard, if you will. And then there are other kind of one-offs in between that. But it's basically saying, hey, if you've done everything you can to do it right, to follow these framework, that's going to help protect both them and ultimately the consumer. So we want the processors and controllers to do that. We can't get in the middle of everybody's individual business, but we can create a kind of a foundational platform for everybody to move forward with.
Okay, I understand. Some additional questions, and on page page 8, the top of the page, lines 170 to 173, that section, it limits the companies that this would apply to those that conduct business in this state by producing products or services targeted to consumers of this state that exceeds 25 million in revenue. Is that exceeding 25 million in revenue derived in Georgia, or is it 25 million in revenue just period? So in other words, they could have a few customers here, but 25 million in national revenues, or is that a tie or a nexus to Georgia?
It is my understanding that it would be the $25 million in revenue in Georgia.
Okay. And then going down, I see that there's criteria in terms of the sizes, and like line 176 of those that control or process personal information of at least 175,000 consumers. Who does this impact? Is it a fairly small universe of companies? Is it a large universe of companies? Can you give us some more context on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and it's an or, right? It's one or the other, as far as the total number of customers and or the number of transactions for those customers. It's more than you might think it is, right? It's not just the large companies. If you think about any company of size today that deals with a large amount of customers, I've got a couple of small business that I am either an owner or an active participant in. One of my very small businesses meets this threshold, right, because of the type of volume and transactional work that we do. So I don't know if I could give you, Representative Holcomb, an exact, this is the number it's going to hit. But what typically happens when we put these type of frameworks out there for people is most everyone else starts adopting it because, you know what, I want to get to that level, right? I might not be there today, but my goal, my companies are always to grow them, right? So if I see, hey, the standard's up here, most people tend to start conforming to what that standard is anyway, as well as if you are then tied to, you become an affiliate of, or you're bought out by that company, you want to make sure that you're already exceeding the regulatory requirements.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And then for, let me see. On page 12, lines 282 to 286 caught my attention. That would be to allow somebody to have portability of their information. Can you give us an example of when that might take place, or types of companies that might impact?
Certainly. Let's say that your information you have today, and this is a wrong example, but I'm just using it for ease because PHI falls under HIPAA. But you move from doctor to doctor, you can take your electronic medical health records with you, right? To take your data and be able to move it from one place to another place securely is something you might not want to redo that whole thing again, right? So that's a bad example because HIPAA's got their own specific guidelines, but to give a fresh answer off of a quick question, that's my best response.
Okay. Yeah, and HIPAA and banks and stuff are all kind of carved out. That's why I was trying to think of who this might impact. And I don't know if there's anybody out in the audience that knows. So, okay. And then
Well, I've got a good one for you. You are an attorney, if my memory serves correct, isn't it?
yes.
What about from attorney to attorney?
That could be. I guess we're not specifically excluded, although there is a debate whether or not the General Assembly has the ability to regulate the practice of law. So
Is that the legislative or executive branch?
the courts, interestingly. So, all right. And then I have a couple more questions, Mr. Chairman, if you don't mind, just kind of working through it. This is pretty dense, so trying to make sure I understand it. For opting out in the very next section, so like 287 to 291, an individual could opt out. These are some of the rights that they would have, and it says that would prevent the companies from using it for targeted advertising or profiling for decisions and stuff like that. So with like social media platforms, if you were to opt out, that would eliminate that ability for them to then do targeted ads. Is that correct?
Correct. You have an opt-out provision. Now, some people, if you get a free platform, might give you the decision, hey, you either take what I give you or you can leave the platform and still opt out and take your information away. And I think you're seeing that in some cases, and I'm going to use an example. I went to a news site the other day, a national news site, that said, it gave me that first thing, do you allow us to track? And I said no. But all of a sudden, when I wanted to click on each one of the articles, now it's making me watch a video or put my email address in there, right? So it's part of the process where they're saying, well, free is not necessarily free. And that's how the industry is starting to move at this time.
Okay, I understand. Okay, one other question is on the privacy notices. I know like Graham Leach Bliley requires those to be sent out annually, so probably everybody's used to getting them in the mail or electronically. Do we have when they have to do it, or is it just when somebody signs up, or are there any recurring obligations to send it on an annual basis or anything like that?
No, but you can go to those sites and they will have a revision and give you a 45-day time to remove your data from the site.
Okay. All right. Yeah, and then my last sort of comment statement is just on the enforcement mechanism. I hear you in terms of if the objection to a private cause of action would be potentially lots of lawsuits, litigation costs, et cetera. But at the same token, it strikes me that if this impacts an individual, to then force it to go through the Attorney General's office, force someone there to pay attention to it, to file something, to do something with it. I suppose if this passes, I'd want to tightly watch it and see how that is working in terms of implementation, and then we could potentially adjust down the road. I don't necessarily object to having the Attorney General have this authority, but I wouldn't want there to be a lot of barriers for actions to take place. So if you do have a bad actor who just is completely ignoring requests to do this, and then no action is being taken by the Attorney General, then that would cause a problem. So
I think you're spot on with that. I think the Consumer Protection Division, we'd want to have some clarity and sunshine on that, after the first 2-3 years of implementation, to make sure it's doing as intended.
yeah. Okay.
Good point.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate her work.
Sorry, the chairman had to step out for another meeting, so I'll be taking over from here. I believe, we have one more question, 18.
If there's no one else, I'd happy to ask another question if that's
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Chairman. So I wanted to kind of piggyback off of what Chairman Parsons and what Representative Holcomb had alluded to. Is there, and again, I'm still processing the bill, and at least from what I'm reading, I appreciate steps in the right direction to protect Georgians' privacy. But so for MEAG, as the example or the hypothetical is posed, certainly they would be required to maintain, in certain instances, consumer data, but are there any limitations in terms of how they could sell that data for profit?
The sale of data is addressed everywhere, and if they sell it, you have to comply with this unless they're superseded by a federal law. And if not, you have to have an opt-out provision once that data is no longer needed, right? So again, I'll use the EMC example, right? An EMC up to 10 years later, because if they're doing financially good, and our EMC does extraordinarily well, they may be sending us a check for $100, or you might go to that great website we have set up with the Department of Revenue to find some of those dollars. But there does come to a point where it's no longer needed anymore, and we want to give people the chance to opt out at that time.
So,
Now, to be honest with you, in the same case for the organizations, they usually have document and data retention policies put into place, right? Some of those are governed specifically in the federal law, right? That really hits hard when you get to the Gramm-Leach Bios, PCI DSS, and HIPAA. For someone else, though, they typically don't want that data after time anyway because it's an exposure to them.
So in all instances, especially given how broad the definition of, I think it's processor, which essentially, or controller and processor, it covers everybody. So for any selling of data beyond just retention to comply with federal or state law, under this bill would then require disclosure to the consumer along with an opportunity to opt out. Is that what you're saying?
Correct. The disclosure is happening in the beginning, right? 10 years from now, it's not going to be necessarily the company's job to come find you to say, hey, what do you want to do now? It's going to be on the consumer to go to them and say, hey, I want to remove this. There's a 45-day cure period for them to be able to pull that out. The reality is they can do it in 45 seconds, but in lieu of something maybe that was old and archived and not available, it gives an extra time frame for them to make sure they can expunge any of that.
Last question that comes to mind for now, and again, I appreciate discussing
That's
this
great dialogue.
important
Thank you.
issue. So I heard that the Texas bill was very strong in terms of its protections, especially given your analysis of the various state laws. Why Tennessee as opposed to Texas?
That's a great question, and I should have mentioned Texas earlier because in looking at Texas, Utah, Tennessee, Colorado, Virginia, California, we looked at, I think, 8 in total. There seemed to be a consistency forming. And in my desire and had hoped that this would be solved at the federal level. My concern was getting too far off the norms, that it would be very difficult for like a great company here in Georgia, like a Home Depot or a Coca-Cola, who works in all states, for them now to figure out a myriad of things that were going to be so substantively different. So that's why we ended up honing in on that. Texas has a fine law in place. I just think that this one seems to be more consistent as we're working through that, and that's why we work with groups like the Heritage Foundation and others to make sure we're balancing both the consumer and the business side of this house.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you.
Okay, with that said, I don't have a sign-up list, but I will open it up for public comment if anyone's interested in public comment. Guess we'll just do it the good old-fashioned way. You can raise your hand. So, okay, come on over. I'll recognize you. Just please step up to the podium.
All right, Mr. Chairman, my name is Ben Line. I'm Policy Counsel with the ACLU of Georgia. Appreciate having the opportunity to make some public comments here today. Members of the House Technology and Infrastructure Innovation Committee, for years the ACLU and the ACLU of Georgia have called for meaningful privacy protections that empower people to live their lives free from the intrusive corporate surveillance and discrimination powered by technology. A lot of the same things that we just heard from Chairman Albers. We're excited that the General Assembly has signaled its intention to regulate these practices. We just here today because we have some concerns with the language of SB 473 and the trend that a lot of legislation has been on for some time now in some of our sister states that we've been discussing. I began advocating for meaningful privacy legislation, first thing I did when I got to the ACLU, and that was because I had a personal experience. When I was trying to rent an apartment, property managers across the city were asking me to provide my iris pattern and my facial geometry simply to be able to tour an apartment and sign a lease. I have no idea where that information is now, who it was sold to, what it was used for, and how long these companies are going to be retaining this information. The reason I bring this up is I want everyone to be clear that because of the size of this corporation we're talking about, this type of information would not be regulated under this bill. And I'll be left in the same position I'm in now of having no idea what these small companies are doing with information that can be used for all kinds of purposes. SB 473 to the ACLU doesn't meet the bare minimum standards to protect people's privacy and legitimizes a status quo that puts profits over people. The ACLU urges this committee to consider putting the privacy protection of Georgia first when striking a balance and considering more effective language. Corporations that seek to collect as much information as possible in order to turn a profit, they harvest data about what we do at home, what we do at work, what we buy, where we go, what doctors we see, and our contacts with the criminal legal system and more. Many of the same things that Chairman Albers just said. At the federal level, there's not many restrictions outside of finance and medicine, the stuff that we were talking about. And it's incumbent on the states to provide these meaningful protections. When we look at what consumer protection this information should have, the bills that we think are meaningful are bills that at a minimum contain strong restrictions at the point of collection, and that's an opt-in to having your information collected, first and foremost. When we're talking about, as to use Chairman Albert's example, now 1,000, that down to 100, that's still a bunch of people that me as a consumer would have to go out and find where this information is, how they're using it, and try to opt out. At the point of collection, however, that ability to say, no, I don't want my information collected, I know what it is, and I know the scope of it is important. Meaningful legislation has data minimization policies. So in this bill, under my understanding, this biometric information can be collected for any purpose that's disclosed to the consumer, whereas meaningful legislation would have it collected for the purpose of why the consumer is coming to the business, meaning that if I go to that property management company and they require my iris pattern or my facial geometry, that's used for the purpose of whatever, like for scam, to get rid of scammers, and is not going to be retained. They can't be collecting it because they found a profitable revenue stream of selling that information down the road. What we're also looking for is, I think, I heard a question about civil rights protections. We know things with regarding disability and accessibility. That is something that we have strong concerns for with regards to how this information is being collected and how it's being attributed to. A lot of states have legislation that would actually have parts of the legislation that would actually require a civil rights restriction on how this information is used and the impact that it would have on consumers. We believe in a private cause of action. In 2008, Illinois passed a Biometric Information Protection Act, which was the first of a kind in the nation and actually allowed for a private cause of action to go after individuals who are misusing people's information. That private cause of action has been utilized with great effect to go after some bad actors. And we think that instead of being reliant on simply the Attorney General, having all of the consumers in Georgia as their own private attorneys general to go and enforce these meaningful provisions is really what's the most important. And finally, having the ability to preserve local government's ability to find more meaningful restrictions where necessary. And another thing, not have this bill set down that not only would private causes of action be barred under the terms of this bill, but violations of it, which could not be used as a predicate for further civil litigations or class actions, is specifically carved out. And so what we see with that is that we don't want this bill to put fewer abilities to go after bad conduct than we already have, which we are concerned that this bill would do. For those reasons, we're asking this committee to put Georgians' privacy first. I submitted a memorandum to your email to all members yesterday, where we highlighted, one, the blue ribbon model language that the ACLU has been using since 2008, that is a meaningful consumer protection bill that has been used to great effect. We also submitted the legislation of 5 other states that we think are better fits. One of which that we think is the best, what we think would be an adequate compromise at this point is the Texas law. I have that bill for anyone to look at. It's actually law. It's been on the book since 2009. I'll distribute it to any members. It's 2 pages long. It's not 27, and it's specifically...
If I may, I'm trying to keep these to about 2 minutes.
Oh, I'm sorry. I will go ahead and wrap it up here, just to say that language has been provided. It doesn't give us everything we're looking for, but it does strike a balance towards consumers first. And so we would ask that as this committee is considering legislation, that is something that is seriously considered. I know we're trying to track time close, but I'll answer any questions as they exist.
Okay, we'll open it up for 1 or 2 questions, but then we need to move on.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Anybody? No? Going once? Oh, we got one question.
Who did you say you submitted the information to?
Yeah, so it was property managers across the city when I was actually trying to apply for.
No, you said you submitted some alternative.
Oh, it's everyone's email. It went to your admin and your legislative email. It was submitted about 3:00 yesterday.
Okay, I don't think I received that. But my second question is, all the points that you make, do you know if the particular bills that pass with all that information, if they were sort of piecemeal, where you take this section and pass it, maybe pass something else later on, or was it all included inclusively and all in one bill?
So I've only tracked a couple states that have had kind of changes. The one that we're kind of looking at is kind of being the best compromise that we think is striking the best balance. Texas has only been amended once, and it was to, I think it was to strike all financial companies. So I'm not aware of what the process has been about like in some other states, but I'll be happy to do some research on that and get back with you.
All right. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you very much,
Appreciate
Mr.
your
Chair.
testimony. If we have, okay, like I said, since I don't have a sign-up sheet, you'll just kind of have to let me know. And I'm going to set the start-stop timer here for 2 minutes. All right.
My name is Michael Collins. I'm a resident of Atlanta and Senior Director at Colour of Change. Our mission, supported by millions, including approximately 230,000 Georgians, is to promote accountability among corporate and political leaders and to advocate for solutions that propel our nation forward. Since 2005, we've been committed to ensuring the technology and telecommunications industries advance civil rights that meet the needs of the black communities, as outlined in our 2022 Black Tech Agenda. Given the indispensable role technology plays in enabling individuals to access education, employment, healthcare and financial opportunities, SB 473 disappointingly prioritises corporate interests over consumer privacy and protection. The bill undermines consumer autonomy by defaulting to an opt-out model for data monetization and fails to mandate clear disclosure of data collection for data collection purposes. Furthermore, SB 473 lacks a private right of action, depriving consumers of a meaningful recourse for violations of their privacy. The White House has emphasized the importance of privacy protections being included by default and ensuring data collection aligns with quote-unquote reasonable expectations and is limited to what is quote-unquote strictly necessary for the specific context. SB 473 falls short of these principles, particularly by failing to embrace data minimization standards essential for shielding consumers from excessive and unwarranted data collection. The bill's absence of requirements for privacy policies to be easily understandable compounds the issue, leaving consumers uninformed about their rights and the extent of data collection. Consent should go beyond securing a mere yes by providing genuine choice and control to consumers over their data. There is a critical need for clear, transparent communication about data practices, a crucial aspect lacking in SB 473. The significance of affirmative consent in privacy practices has been underscored by the emergence of frameworks like Apple's App Tracking Transparency. This framework demonstrates that when consumers are presented with a straightforward choice, they overwhelmingly opt out of data tracking, challenging the notion that consent mechanisms fail to protect consumer privacy. Such a stance resonates with the increased demand for legislation mandating affirmative consent for data collection and processing. The impact of this bill is particularly concerning for Black Georgians. Discriminatory practices such as online redlining have historically targeted Black individuals, exacerbating systemic inequalities. These practices persist, facilitated by unchecked collection and monetization of data. The bill's shortcomings in addressing these issues only serve to entrench these discriminatory practices. For these reasons, Colour of Change opposes SB 473. We urge a revision that mandates affirmative consent for data collection, ensures transparency and accountability in data practices, and introduces a private right of action for consumers. Such changes are vital for protecting all Georgians, particularly those in marginalised communities, from invasive data practices and for moving our state towards a more equitable technological future. Thank you.
All right, you have one, or you want to take questions, or you, okay.
Thank you.
So I recognize you.
Thank you. I have one quick question. I know what redlining is in the historical context. What is online redlining?
It's a practice where, like, let me give you an example. A couple of years ago, mortgage companies were found by Brookings Institute to be directing ads towards certain communities, excluding certain communities from mortgage companies, offering higher rates to Black and Latino communities. Sure.
All right, you have no more questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else that'd like to testify? All right. Please step to the mic and state your name.
Yes, good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. Chris Bruce, local Black man. I'm here really, and I'm going to waive my testimony altogether just to plead for the simplicity of this bill. ACLU of Georgia said they want to advance a bill that was passed in Texas, something that's 2 pages, something that is very simple that the consumer can understand. The big companies can pivot towards this. The individual Georgians cannot. So in all fairness towards Georgians, we ask that you actually take this under consideration. And I can tell you up front, passing the bill, I think it is great. Chairman Albers, I think you're doing a great job within this and addressing this issue. So we really do appreciate it. I just fear that in the future, we're going to find out that there are going to be Georgians that are going to be hurt by this. So we are coming to you and saying we'll be there to help with the advancement of the bill at any time, even if this bill passes. But we're saying for simplicity purposes, let's go with Texas, y'all. I'll probably never say that again, but let's just do that.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank
you.
you.
Don't have any questions.
I didn't think I would, but I appreciate it.
All right. With that, I don't see any more hands. So, Chairman Albers, I'll turn this back over to you if you have any closing comments, and we'll wrap it up.
I just want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Jones, rest of the committee members, very thoughtful, interactive questions. And I appreciate those who spoke today, and I get it. I will say I pass a lot of bills down here. And in the last 14 years, I have learned never, ever let the perfect be the enemy of the possible. Making an advancement forward is 100% more than nothing. So I think us doing a good measured response that balances the consumers and the businesses together is the right approach. I will be working with Sean Marie, feedback from this committee, as well as some folks here in the room as we make some final tweaks to bring a finished product back to you hopefully the next day or two. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chairman Albers. And with that, we are adjourned.